Anyway, so we can't really do this warm up because we're not live, but you guys can just kind of pause and think about it for a minute while you get started. Um, so, what are some effects after the Second National Bank ends? If you guys remember, there was kind of like that feud going on between the president of the bank, John Biddle, and President Andrew Jackson during the election of 1832. If you remember, the bank's charter was up in 1836, but Henry Clay and Daniel Webster really wanted the Whigs to take power. So they tried to make this an issue in the election. They figured, most of the people in the U.S. really like it. It's going to work. Dewey, stop with your squeaky toy, please. I'm sorry, guys. But it backfires. Andrew Jackson still stays president. So I want you to think in your head before we get into it. What are going to be some effects? Because the Second National Bank does end. So then all the power is put into the state banks. There's no really rules for them to follow. There's no regulations put in place by a national bank anymore. What's going to happen now? All right, so again, we're looking at the post-Jackson U.S. So Andrew Jackson's second term ends March 4th, 1837. Let's see what happens next. So we're looking at today, how did the closure of the Second National Bank impact the U.S.? And then the goal of today is that you'll understand how events in history can cause major change. So it's kind of like, I want you to think like a domino effect, right? One thing happens and all these dominoes can fall. That's what happens at this point in history. All right, so this is where the notes start. So the great thing with this video, everybody, is you can go at your own pace. I know sometimes on Zoom it can be a little tough. So with these notes, if you need to get it, just pause the video, get the notes, carry on. So the panic begins. Jackson was alarmed at risky land investment. So I'm going to explain what that means. So these people are, they're called land speculators. They basically borrow more and more money to buy land, so prices begin to go up for the land. To slow the process down, basically Jackson ordered that anyone buying public land had to pay with it with gold or silver, right? Speculators, these land speculators, rush to state banks. They want to exchange their paper money for gold and silver. This is supposed to represent gold and silver, right? But many banks lent too much money. Remember, if you go back to the last lesson, they don't have rules anymore. They can lend as much as they want. That's what ends up happening. They didn't have enough gold and silver to back up this paper currency, and they were forced to close down. So all these banks start slowly but surely closing down. This is how it gets started. So some background information before we get into what happens is, following the president left by George Washington, Andrew Jackson leaves office after 2 terms, right? He doesn't go for a 3rd term. So now up next, we still are Democratic candidate. Americans elect in the next election. We're not focusing on this election, but they elect Martin Van Buren as the next president. This is the guy. Kind of like his haircut. Might do that next time. But anyway, they're elected. He's a Democrat from Jackson's party, right? Even though Jackson was pretty controversial, Americans still are fans of the Democratic Party at this point. So let's see what happens. Coffee break. So the Panic of 1837. This is going to be the main topic of this lesson. This is a popular image from this time. You can see this is a list of this individual's debt. This was a popular artist portrayal during this time. He did not say, bro, I'm broke. I put that in there. But this is what happens in 1837. And again, right after Andrew Jackson leaves office. So some background information on the Panic of 1837 is Van Buren faced the worst economic crisis the nation had ever known since its, independence. After the Bank of the U.S. closed, state banks, like I said, could lend as much money as they wanted. They could give out loans without any limits. Even though that sounds great, right? You can have a loan, you can have a loan. Loans have to be paid back, people, right? So to meet the demands for the loans, state banks start printing more and more paper money. This will never work out in any country's favor. You can't just print more money and expect things to be fine. When they print more and more money, like I already said, they did not have enough gold or silver to back up their paper money. You have to have enough gold and silver to back up the paper money, or this paper money becomes worthless. So the economic crisis begins. Because of this, soon into Martin Van Buren's presidency, the nation plunges into a deep economic depression. I'm sure you've heard this word before. I'm sure you've probably heard of the Great Depression. We won't cover that. That actually, happens in 1929, almost 100 years after the Panic of 1837, but a depression is just a period when the economy shrinks and many people start to lose their jobs. This depression doesn't, end quickly. The depression lasts for 5 years, and during the worst period, 90%, yes, 90% of all the nation's factories are closed. So that's insane. Think of all the people that are working in the factories. Don't think of them as just buildings. These are people in here working that have to provide for their families, and they're closing. So hundreds of thousands of people were out of work. When people aren't working and receiving money for their families, they're going to get really, really angry and upset. So now I want you to put yourself in their shoes for a minute. Who are you going to blame for this situation? Are you going to say, oh, it just happens, it's, natural, the economy will bounce back? Are you going to blame someone like Andrew Jackson, who was the president before and had the national bank closed? Are you going to blame the current president, Martin Van Buren? What are your options? So let's see. So people start blaming Van Buren and his policies. It's because he's the current president, right? They're not looking back at what Andrew Jackson did, even though, the closing of the Second National Bank definitely had a huge impact on this. They start blaming the current president. So literally, Martin Van Buren, more like Martin Van Ruin. That's literally what they start calling him. Poor guy. And part of it, could be his fault because he believed in the idea of laissez-faire economics. If you guys remember, we talked about this in Thomas Jefferson's presidency. And it's the idea that the government is kind of hands-off, right? So they have a small role in the economy. He figures the economy will figure out itself. We shouldn't have our hands in it. We shouldn't be giving out, checks to people or anything like that. He's saying the government should not play a role in this. Laissez-faire actually means let do. So let it go. It'll figure itself out. However, this isn't the case at all. As the Depression wore on, years go by, Van Buren just becomes more and more popular as his term goes on, right? And again, his opponents start calling him Martin Van Ruin because they figure he's ruining everything. In reality, Martin Van Buren, not like he calls this, but at the same time, he's not doing anything to help these Americans. So now up next, so after 4 years in office with Martin Van Ruin, we have another election, right? So by the time the next election for president occurred in 1840, Whigs and Democrats developed more democratic ways to choose presidential candidates. So we have a caucus and a nominating convention. The nominating convention is definitely more democratic, but we also do have a caucus. So the caucus is basically powerful members of each party held private meetings to choose their candidates. So critics actually called the caucus system undemocratic because only a few powerful people were able to take part in it. So, if you remember, the Constitution starts with we the people. So shouldn't there be, more individuals, more Americans participating? So that's where the idea of the nominating convention comes along. So where delegates from all states choose the party's candidate for president. So people could now have some influence in the nominating process. It feels more democratic. You have a voice. It encouraged citizen participation in elections. And today, the major political parties still hold conventions. So the past year, we had the Republican National Convention and we had the Democratic National Convention where they nominated, former President Trump and the current President Joe Biden. So let's continue with this election. Van Buren had lost a lot of support, right? Martin Van Ruin, he's not doing anything. However, the Democrats choose him to run for re-election in 1840 anyway. The Whigs, on the other hand, they choose someone very well known, William Henry Harrison, as their presidential candidate, and John Tyler of Virginia as their vice president. And here's a picture actually of William Henry Harrison, during the presidential run. And then this is him, 30 years prior, a little throwback. If you remember earlier in the year, he was actually known during this time as the hero of the Battle of Tippecanoe. And this is where he went to Prophetstown and he burned the town down. If you remember the individual Tecumseh who tried to unite all the Native American tribes in 1811. And remember, we talked about how he really did commit some harsh atrocities on Native American tribes and things like that in Prophetstown. And the Whigs really try to focus on Harrison's war record because he was a really, good war hero. But we're going to look at the details of that in this cool video coming up next, actually. And what's funny is that they actually develop a slogan. So they develop Tippecanoe and Tyler too, and it becomes their campaign slogan. So this election starts to modernize how elections are. It starts to kind of actually look how elections are today in a little bit. We're going to look at that in a video. So again, continuing with this election, what's funny with the Whigs is the Whigs try to create this image for Harrison as a man of the people from the Western frontier. Sounds familiar, right? They're trying to kind of do what Andrew Jackson did, right? They're trying to say, he's the man of the common people. He's from the Western frontier. They actually present him as kind of this humble farmer and boasted that he was actually born in a log cabin, like this one I have here. But in reality, the Whigs candidate Harrison was a wealthy, educated man who at the time of his campaign actually lived in like a huge, large mansion. He wasn't even born in a log cabin. So they try to paint this picture because, sometimes in politics, people just really want to win and get their person in. So they try to paint this image to the American public. But in reality, this isn't his background story. But this is what the Whigs do. In fact, I believe this was a postcard. So you can see this is how they try to present him and really try to sell him to the public. You can see the log cabin there, Tippecanoe and Tyler 2s, over that, it's on wheels. So that's how they try to paint William Henry Harrison. And, because Martin Van Buren was so unpopular, the Whigs win. William Henry Harrison becomes president. The Whigs' policies included, so this is what the Whigs want to do when he becomes president. They want to create a new bank of the U.S. that kind of unifies the U.S. They want internal improvements. So remember, we talked about this, I believe, under John Quincy Adams. So internal improvements are things like fixing roads, bridges, other things like that. And they also want a new high tariff so that income from the tariff can, stimulate the economy and help people get back into work, things like that. However, these are all the things they want to do when William Henry Harrison becomes president. However, something unfortunate happens. And we're going to watch a video coming up next, and you all should be able to hear this.
Who's the president who delivered the longest inaugural speech in history and served the shortest time in office? William Henry Harrison may not be first in the hearts of his countrymen, but he's a favorite in presidential trivia contests.
He was the only president whose wife, after the White House was born, never made it into the White House. Poor Mrs. Harrison was still packing back in Ohio when he died.
New York Times columnist Gail Collins is the author of a book about our ninth president. Harrison's time in office may have been a trifling 31 days, but his road to the White House is legendary.
The campaign of 1840 is actually quite modern.
Very modern. I mean, it's even more modern than we are sometimes.
Oh, who has heard the great commotion, motion?
There were songs.
It is the ball a-rolling on for Tippecanoe and Tyler too.
Plenty of spin, merchandising, and
he had the first campaign slogan, Tippecanoe and Tyler too.
Harrison was an Army general, nicknamed the Hero of Tippecanoe after the site of an Indian battle. But, Collins points out,
all of his victories involved him having way more people than the other side.
A mere technicality. Harrison was likable and had no strong political beliefs, a perfect candidate for the newly formed Whigs.
And he looked like a president.
He looked sort of presidential. He was very sort of tall and thin and, good posture. And
a great nose also.
Great nose, very Roman kind of thing.
But Harrison's ticket to the White House was an anti-Harrison editorial that derided him as a crotchety old soldier drinking hard cider in a log cabin. In a brilliant act of political jujitsu, the Harrison campaign embraced the caricature.
Join the run for Harrison, log cabin and hard cider.
Replica log cabins stocked with hard cider appeared at Harrison campaign stops everywhere. His opponent, Martin Van Buren, was tarred as the rich, out-of-touch guy. Ironic, since Harrison was actually born here, a plantation in Virginia. Nope, not a splinter of truth to the log cabin story.
We see this still today, that there's a desire, if you happen to be an aristocrat running for public office, to make yourself seem like one of the people.
The public bought the image and everything associated with it. 80% of eligible voters turned out, a record to this day. At a time when life expectancy was just 39 and a half years old, William Henry Harrison was sworn in at age 68.
It would be like 110 today.
Yeah, something amazing. He was very hale and hearty.
And to prove it, William Harrison delivered a 2-hour speech on his inauguration day, in the rain, without an overcoat. He dropped dead 31 days later.
He's a great lesson in bringing an umbrella.
an umbrella and wearing a hat.
And not making a 2-hour speech. In general, I think we could rally around the idea of not making a 2-hour speech anywhere, under any circumstances.
All right, so kind of insane there. After Harrison's death, because of that speech he gave, he really tries to show to the people that, although he's 68, and that's like ancient for this time period. It's like, how are you still alive, dude? He tries to show the people, I'm old, but I'm going to be a great president. I'm going to give you this 2-hour speech. I'm not wearing a coat, even if it's raining. So he literally catches pneumonia at his inauguration, and he dies 31 days after because he caught that. So, it's kind of insane, but he's actually, the shortest president term ever. So after Harrison's death, this is what I want to focus on now. The Whigs' hopes, those policies I talked about, they never come true. So soon after taking office, President Harrison died of pneumonia. Again, if a president dies in office, the vice president then becomes president. So John Tyler, his VP, becomes president. And he really failed to live up to the Whig expectations. Because if you remember when we talked about the Whigs forming and the Democrats under Jackson, the Whigs form, but they're kind of like a loose alliance with one another, right? They are all kind of from all different parts of the country. They all kind of have different ways about how they see the party. John Tyler really just kind of fails to live to the Whig expectations. And in fact, the Whigs actually throw John Tyler out of their political party months after he took office. So it's kind of insane. That wouldn't necessarily happen today, but this is the reality of what happens after his death. So ignore that homework. But after this, you're done. And we're actually finished the Age of Jackson unit. So we're going to be hopping into our next unit now. So if you're done with this, again, you can go through the video, rewind it, go back and get notes if you need it. So you can submit this. Again, make sure your Trail of Tears is submitted along with these notes. So, yep, that's all I got for today.